I welcome you to the last session, last day of the 3-day conference that we have been attending on archaeology of Buddhism, recent discoveries in South Asia. This session will be chaired by the Director General of Department of Archaeology, Sri Lanka, Professor Dissanayake, an eminent archaeologist in his own right. May I call Dr. Dissanayake to come to the head table and assume the chair. Thank you very much. Before I hand over the mic and the floor to Dr. Dissanayake, don't let this happen. Please put your mobile phones on silent mode, and if you are required to take any call, please step out of this hall and take your call. Thank you very much, Dr. Dissanayake. The floor is yours.
Dr. Bopearachi from Sri Lanka. He now works in the Sorbonne University as well as the Berkeley University in America. He's an eminent archaeologist, as you all know. I call upon Professor Bopearachi to make your presentation. The title is Cults of Avalokiteshvara as a Curia of the Sick and Cure of the Sick and Save of Mariners in ancient Sri Lanka.
Difficult to do any argument. So what I would do is I just read the introduction and the conclusion, and in between I show the photographs. So Sri Lanka's central position in the Indian Ocean made it an important player in the long-distance maritime trade in the region. The most important characteristic of all the ancient ports around the island is their geographical situation at the river mouths, lagoons and waterfronts. The location of emporia along rivers must have facilitated transactions within interior regions. Archaeological data obtained from excavations and surface explorations provide much needed evidence for the international contacts established between the Western and the South Asian traders on the regional trade network between South India and Sri Lanka. We hope to discuss in this paper the impact of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara as the protector of mariners and the cure of sick, whose shrines were erected in his honor at the port sites where Mahayana became popular in the island. This is a preliminary report of the ongoing project, consisted of plotting all the Avalokiteshvara images found in the island by GIS. So this is a larger project of plotting all the Avalokiteshvara images in South India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia and China, done with the collaboration of the Department of Archaeology and the Archaeological Survey of India, and we are different partners: University of Sorbonne Paris 4, University of California at Berkeley, Nalanda Sri Vijaya Center in Singapore, University of Virginia and University of Vienna. So we will be doing only the Sri Lankan parts. It is well known, unlike Brahmanism, Buddhism looked favorably upon trade activities. As revealed by epigraphical micro-evidence, the earliest donors and important patrons of Buddhist establishments of South Asia were caravan merchants and wealthy seafaring traders. The spread of Buddhism from Indian subcontinent to South Asia is closely connected with the growth of trade routes by merchants, traveling monks and teachers. The earliest images and some portable marble reliefs depicting various Buddhist themes found in Sri Lanka were originally executed in Amaravati Nagarjunakonda and were brought to the island by pious traders or pilgrims as offerings. It was during this period when the South Indian traders who were playing the intermediate role between Roman traders and Sri Lankans came from Andhra and Tamil Nadu to Sri Lanka in search of merchandise. Some donors of the caves of the earliest buildings of the Buddhist monks were Navikas, mariners and Vanikas. So I'll go very fast with the photographs. And the starting point is the inscription of the 7th century found at Tiriyaya, published by Selva Panavitana, speaking directly and naming the Bodhisattva as Avalokiteshvara. So this is the inscription, and this is Tiriyaya, and Panavitana concluded that Tiriyaya should have been a Mahayana center. In 1983, in April, Department of Archaeology did some excavations in the Padanagara here, and they found these statues very clearly of Avalokiteshvara with the Amitabha image as a spiritual father on the Jatamakuta. And then the images of Tara, and also the images of Adibuddha or Vajradharma, depicting 5 Tathagatas, Akshobhya, Amitabha, Amoghasiddhi, Ratnasambhava and Vairochana. And these two sculptures were certainly imported from from India, North India, of the Pala tradition, not made in Sri Lanka. So the importance is, Tiriyaya is situated on the bank of the Yan River, which flows to the Indian Ocean at Kalvaraya. So there are two types. One is the Avalokiteshvara as the cure of the sick, where you find it in Damegura, the huge statue of Avalokiteshvara, and as a protector of mariners, especially these are from the caves of Ajanta, where the legend or the Avadana story of Sinhala Avadana, where you can see the Avalokiteshvara taking the form of a white horse, rescuing the mariners. And then if you go to most of the sites in the Maharashtra, Ajanta, Kanheri and other places, especially in Aurangabad, where you can see the Ashtamaha appear or the litany of Avalokiteshvara, where he protects people from the enraged animals and from poisonous reptiles, wild beasts, evil spirits and shipwrights, and captivity and slavery, and sword of the enemy, and devouring fire. These are all connected with the trade activities and also the pilgrims in India. So this is the reputation of Avalokiteshvara. In Sri Lanka, when we look at them, there are two types of Avalokiteshvara statues. One is the Yogi Avalokiteshvara or the ascetic. The other one is the princely or the village type or Kumara type. So one is from the Budurogil, the other one is from Damegura. And then if you follow the argument by Donian, who wrote his thesis on Avalokiteshvara, there is a relationship between the ascetic type and the Trimurti cave temple Shiva image. So this is one from Mudhu Mahavihara, where you get the same influence. So if this is true, the most of the Avalokiteshvara images found in the island cannot be dated before the 7th century. So if you look at, we have been working, Department of Archaeology and the French Archaeological Mission, in all the western seaports and the southern seaports, and we have started in the east coast now. And you get two main clusters of Avalokiteshvara. One is around Trikomali, the 5th largest natural harbour in the world, and then the down south, Kelinda and Godavari. Apart from that, in the wet zone, you get the statues of Pusharajagara. There is, of course, I don't want to enter into discussion about this. Some consider, someone else, but mainly it should be to follow the Sadhanamala or the Sivanadi location, Sivanadi location. And then you get some in Kobegene and in Mandai, and also in Anuradhapura. There are several Avalokiteshvara images, and especially the one recently found in the river of Malvatoya in Anuradhapura itself. I am showing the photograph thanks to the Director General of Archaeology, Dr. Selva Dissanayake. And this is one of the best statues ever found in the island. And then you get that also in Tambopolapatnam, where the sacred Bodhi tree was taken. And if you, they stop at Kantirimale, where you can see the Avalokiteshvara center. And then in Mudhu Mahavihara, there are two types of Avalokiteshvara. One is the ascetic type, other one is the princely. And along the below here, you get Buddha Patuna, again these two types. So if you come to the cluster around the Trincomalee, which is the largest natural harbour in the country, and directly connected with Polonnaruwa, there are tens of architectural images, both types, acidic and the Princely type, and also in Seruvilla, and also Piliaya, and recently Department of Archaeology found this in Muttur, and also last year we have been doing some work in Kuchaveli, and there of course they found Padavitana Pond 1956, an imported statue from Nagarjunakonda, and our excavations done by the Department of Archaeology and the French archaeologists, and we found exact data for the trade center. Again, the inscription on this bull, which clearly says this was a Mahayana center, this was published by Padavitana as well. And these are some of the results of our excavations. And there are again about tens of architectural images, both acidic and the Princely type. And then I come to the down south, here again, around the Kilindi area, where again an imported statue of Buddha from Nagarjunakonda, of the Nagarjunakonda marble, was found along with two statues of Avalokiteshvara. Again, there are in Yatala and also in Situlpawa, the both types, here again, like the ones at Buddha Padma and Mudumara Vihara, and also Girihandutaya along the Balavikanga. And then, of course, connected with Godavaya. I don't want to enter into that because it's a long subject. And recently found shipwrecks dating back to the 2nd century BC would show that there were certainly a harbour, very important one there. And also the Godavaya inscription of the 2nd century AD, giving the right to the master to take taxes. And also the our excavations, Department of Archaeology and the French archaeology at Rudigama, and it shows this. So I'm sorry for going too fast with this. Just to, if you have any questions, we can discuss this. So let me read the conclusion. The preliminary investigation on the spatial distribution of the Avalokiteshvara statues in Sri Lanka as a whole show the importance of the role played by Avalokiteshvara as the protector of the mariners. Although the research on this subject is still in its initial stage, it is obvious that the cult worship of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara as the healer of the sick or protector of mariners was very popular in Sri Lanka. The Pali Chronicles, written by the Buddhist monks of the Mahavihara of the Theravada tradition, were primarily concerned with using the religious and political events to illustrate the importance of the Theravada Buddhism. Although the Mahavamsa does not make any reference to the doctrinal or institutional manifestations of Mahayana, the archaeological and epigraphic evidence discussed in this paper show very clearly that, like Shivaism, Vaishnavism and Jainism, Mahayana Buddhism played a significant role in the history of the island. It is quite possible that by the 8th century, the so-called, when the Buddhists of Kanchi supported the secret and mystical beliefs of the esoteric and exoteric subsects of the Great Waker. From this period onwards, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara gained great popularity as attested by the large number of his images erected all over the island. The Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is also known as Lokeshvara, Lokeshwaranatha, Lokanatha or Natha, is venerated today as God Natha, Natha Deyo. The same Natha is also mentioned as Shivanatha, Brahmanatha, Vishnunatha, Gaurinatha, Matsendranatha, Bhadranatha, Buddhanatha and Garanatha. In ancient Sri Lanka, Buddhist art underwent drastic changes as the focus of trade changed from one horizon to the other. In many cases, even without precise textual evidence, artistic expressions show the effects of different cultures. In short, the emergence of a new Mahayana iconography must be seriously considered when studying the historical diversity of different cultures. It is thus important to launch a systematic study of the images of Avalokiteshvara as well as of Lokeshvara, Lokeshwaranatha and Natha erected in the sanctuaries at the river mouths facing the sea and inland along the navigable rivers. I thank you very much.
this presentation.
Well, Boparachi, could you, this is moving slightly away, the position of Tara in this whole exercise is there.
Tara cannot be separated from Avalokiteshvara as the partner of his life. And also Tara played a very important role in the international trade. In our project, we will be taking both as one. But the main key role was played by Avalokiteshvara as the hero of Sikh and the protector of mariners. That's the reason why we found so many Tara images along the rivers, yes. Like the one in the British Museum which came from Trikomani.
But the others are also being documented.
Yes, so we have just completed the GIS project in the northeastern part, that is along Trikomani, as you have seen. So full bibliographical images and everything giving all the dimensions like all the GIS projects. So we hope to do it this winter in the other places. Yes, ma'am.
Maitri Buddha, that belief is there down south. And I would like to know your comment on this.
Yeah, the thing is, it's very interesting because Maitri should be the next Buddha according to Theravada. Not even Mahayana, so he should be the next. As you know, Buddha said he will be my successor when Nalanda was crying the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. But in Sri Lanka, there's a very interesting thing. If you go to Dhammeguru now, it's very clear it's Avalokiteshvara image with Amitabha on the Tatavakuta. But there are people coming every day asking for curing the sick, people who have, who had a lot of problems, cancer and other things. But they don't pray to Avalokiteshvara, but they pray to Maitreya. So I told him this is not Maitreya, this is Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, it doesn't matter. So it goes on. So the Natha cult has become so popular in the country. It's very difficult to find any Maitreya images in Sri Lanka. There are very few found in Navagiri and other places. Most of the other statues which are venerated even in the, I was really amazed, in the Kilingara, the statue which is venerated at Mahasen is a statue of Avalokiteshvara. It's not Mahasen. So most of these things that are taken as things, they are Avalokiteshvara. So in Sri Lanka, the Natha Deyo had a very precise role, and he will be the next Buddha in this day. And there's a legendary thing. I agree with you. So I have done some work on that as well. Thanks for asking this question.
Down south.
This is very down south, yes, Rona and also the Goa province. Because the interesting thing is that the inscription of Tiriyaya, which is in Palavadanta, refers to him as Avalokiteshvara. That's the first inscription we have in the country, where this Bodhisattva is referred to as Avalokiteshvara. But he later came as Natha. If you see the Kandi Karahara, Avalokiteshvara does not appear as Avalokiteshvara, but he would appear as Natha Deyo. He said, and also the other places. It has gone to such an extent, the Natha has also almost become Vishnu. In the southern, as Dr. Dayal said, in Roma, in southern places. So it's the same person. Only difference is Avalokiteshvara is a Bodhisattva, a Buddha to become. But when he became a Natha Deyo, he has become almost a god in the country. It's the same person.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for illuminating
tradition, especially in your region. Because some of the images you showed in your paper in more detail. You get the role of the Tara is very important. You can separate both. And the best place is in Sri Lanka, the Tara appears on the left-hand side of the Bodhisattva, and on the right-hand side there supposed to be Sam Sudana Kumara. So it's always there. If you look at some of the Chinese traditions, it's Avalokiteshvara appears as a man or a woman, as you know, in the Chinese tradition. So it's very ambiguous whether it's really Avalokiteshvara or really a female figure as Tara. So this development takes place somewhere around the 10th and the 12th century, especially in Southeast Asia, where Avalokiteshvara appears as a lady, as a woman. So that's the other counterpart of Avalokiteshvara as Tara. The first statues of Avalokiteshvara found in Sri Lanka, they came from the East Coast, from Tiriyaya and other places, and they were not made in the country, they are all part of traditions. So they should have come from Bihar. and also from Bangladesh. So those are the earliest, but it cannot be before the 5th century. I would even say 6th century. Some of the statues that you showed in Bengal, where the hair is coming over the shoulder, this is ascetic type of that Dorian species presented in the Harvard University. So those are the earliest, and then the imports from Bihar, and then from Orissa, and then the local ones that I showed on the stone images, they are all 8th, if not 9th century. But it continues until today. I mean, Avalokiteshvara is venerated at Nanda. I can't find a single temple in this country where Nanda is not represented as a god.
The second presentation will be done by Dr. Chandre Basu from India. The title of the presentation is Archaeology and Art History, a survey of recent trends, methodologies for studying early Northwest India. I invite Dr. Basu to make your presentation.
Thank you very much. In my extended paper, I contrasted two approaches that have characterized the archaeology of Northwest India in the past 60 years. One of the approaches I term as the collections-oriented approach, and the second approach is a contextual approach. Both are very closely linked to and have very important implications for the study of early Buddhist art, particularly the well-known sculptures from Mathura and Gandhara. The collections-oriented approach is best illustrated by this 19th century photograph taken in Mathura by Joseph Beglar in 1818. And the primary goal of this approach is to use archaeology to find new sculptures, basically to increase the repertoire of images of Mathura and Gandhara in museum collections. And the second goal is to use stratigraphical evidence from excavations to date the sculptures. So this overwhelming emphasis on chronology and on individual sculptural pieces, particularly religious, with religious iconography, has tended to push the study of context to the background. Creating, I believe, a rather unidimensional image of what a Buddhist site is by focusing on religious imagery and the select monuments to which these images may have belonged. The more recent archaeological projects, notably those undertaken by the Italian missions in Swat, have begun to address broader culture beyond the issue of chronology and art collecting. So among the emerging themes in a recent art historical and archaeological scholarship, there is one theme that addresses multiple identities constituting early Buddhist communities. Specifically, people have looked at the coexistence of Buddhist and pre-Buddhist cults, such as those focusing on Nagas or serpent deities. A discussion of the Naga cult and its relationship, both physical and symbolic, to Buddhist sacred areas has in turn led to the analysis of the roles played by Buddhist monasteries in controlling and managing local water resources. So a focus more on context, more on the larger socio-economic background of the interaction. So these broader studies suggest that early Buddhist sites in Northwest India were multi-dimensional spaces serving diverse communities. One example, and I'm sorry for the crude map after our presentation yesterday, this probably doesn't meet the minimum standards, but we work with what we have. So an example of pluralism at Buddhist sacred sites comes from the Kushan period in Mathura, which is about approximately 200 kilometers southeast of Delhi. From this site is known by inscription for a very prominent Buddhist monastery called the Buddhishka Vihara dating to the Kushan period. and the inscriptions and the artworks were collected in the 19th century from this area of Jamalpur. This is approximately 3 miles southeast of Katra, which is marked in red. Katra is the area that was excavated recently in the 70s by the Archaeological Survey of India, and it is suggested that that's the urban center of ancient Mathura. So we have an urban center and then we have a Buddhist monastic sites. So judging from the large number of art, sculptures and inscriptions from the site of Jamalpur, we know that this was the site of a very prominent prosperous Buddhist monastic settlement from the Kushan through the Gupta period, so quite a long time. And the donors were cosmopolitan, they were monks, they collaborated with lay people, with officials, and we have a number of stone pillar bases with points where you can insert perhaps a pillar, or some of these are plain on the top, but they are all, and perhaps could have been used as seats, but they are all inscribed on the rim with donated inscriptions. So a lot of inscriptional evidence, and the inscriptional evidence also points to the co-option or the coexistence of the Buddhist monastery with a local Naga shrine. And that is very interesting. There is, however, and the Naga was a local Naga named Dadikarna. We have a statue of Dadikarna, very small statue inscribed with his name, but this is not from an archaeological excavated context is found, as many Mathura sculptures are from the riverbed. So that is one of the major points that I've highlighted in my paper, is the absence of archaeological context, architectural structures in Mathura, but a lot of information from the inscriptions and from the artwork. And later on I'll contrast this with Pakistan. So Dadikarna's sculpt seems to have been co-opted. We know that because the specific wording on the donated inscriptions from Jamalpur associated with the Naga shrine follow Buddhist donated formulae of asking for the merit to be transferred to parents, even though the donation is being made to the Naga shrine. So what we can learn from the site of Jamalpur, even though it has not been excavated, the 3 points. One is that Buddhist viharas in large multi-sectarian environments, such as Mathura, were not isolated enclaves. 2, that monastic groups often chose sites associated with powerful local cults, such as Nagas, and often developed these cults. And 3, that lay supporters of a Buddhist vihara could simultaneously associate with these cults and be instrumental in integrating them with Buddhism. In such a pluralistic environment, which is as much Buddhist as it is Naga, sectarian identities may be less clearly demarcated in the architectural landscape. And that is fundamental in keeping in mind, if somebody wants to excavate a Buddhist site, and focuses very narrowly on sculptures with clearly Buddhist iconography, looking for stupas and viharas, I think we are missing 50% of the pluralism that could have existed, the coexistence, etc. I'm going to skip the next 3 slides. Lots of evidence of sites in Mathura where you can see this coexistence, possibly, but none of it has been excavated. And I'm going to stick to a site called Som, which is 14 miles southwest of Katra, of the center. Because this was a site that was selected in the mid-60s by a German team of archaeologists led by Herbert Herdl as a site that might produce larger areas of architectural structures, unquote. So this was the first time that archaeologists actually went out looking for context rather than for sculptures for museums, at least in the case of Mathura. It was a very well-planned, well-executed excavation from 1966 to 74, and the final report is available, very well published, so scholars have a lot of evidence to work with, but it's tantalizingly enigmatic. Why? Because we know the archaeologist was very focused on chronology, so stratigraphy has been worked out for the limited part that was excavated. We know a lot about the settlement, the houses, the streets, the interface between 2 axial shrines. and the habitational centers and so on. But there are a lot of questions that would allow us to understand the larger historical context of the site that remain as question marks. And those are the relationship between the urban settlement and the suburban surroundings, the socio-economic base of the resident communities. All this was left, we still don't know, even though we have a very thick report of the excavation. Perhaps because chronology was the focus. Very quickly, these are the finds. The Apsali Temple number 1 on brick, dating to the early 1st century BC and then going through the Kushan period. We do not know, we don't have evidence, even though it's been beautifully excavated. What went on here, what was the cult? We only know that it was surrounded by, it was in the middle of the habitational center. The second Apsali temple, which I marked with the blue arrows, today protected by the Archaeological Survey of India with its own shed. Right behind that shed you can see the spire of a tall Hindu temple, and that has encroached, it's ballooned in size between 1996 and 2006. This is one of the problems in archaeology in the region. In fact, Hertel, the excavator, when he went in and dug this Apsali temple in the 60s, that shrine was very tiny, but he still couldn't extend his excavations. Today the shrine has ballooned, and I'll show you what that temple looks like. So this is the general view. The interior of the Apsali shrine has a circular base in the apse, and that. So there's no archaeologically. This is a big question mark. What was this used for? We don't know. Except then the archaeologists have fallen back on the sculptures that they found. There are two categories. One is four-sided Naga stele from the Kushan period that is still in worship in the modern temple. And here's the modern temple. You can see how large it's become. It almost abuts the archaeological site. This is the Naga stele. You can make out the hoods, and Hertel actually had it cleaned in the 60s, and so he's photographed what the stele looks like under this application of vermilion. So that's one, and then we also found in situ the remains of a stone railing and gateway, which all seem to have the theme of serpents. And that has led him to conclude that this was an independent Naga shrine. However, the question here is, given the evidence that we have from inscriptions, particularly from the site that I just talked to you about earlier, where the Naga shrine is incorporated into a Buddhist environment, we really can't say, on the basis of these sculptural finds and the excavations, whether this was an independent Naga shrine or whether this was also being absorbed into a Buddhist environment. Certainly, the expansion of the site with a stone railing indicates a big jump in patronage, and that usually is attracted by larger communities like the Buddhists in the Kushan period. So that is so. And so quickly to sum up for Mathura, as we can see, even the best excavations in Mathura, methodically conducted excavations succeed in raising more questions than answers. In terms of Naga worship in hydraulic architecture, again we have we have fragments of sculptures, inscriptions. This is a channel, stone channel with an inscription talking about the dedication of waterworks to the Mahasambrikas, sect in Mathura. Troughs with water imagery, again Makara, but again very little context. So Mathura's archaeological record provides very little help in understanding the epigraphic, the vast epigraphic and visual evidence for the growing visibility of Naga cults and hydraulic architecture. By contrast, in Gandhara, where epigraphic records are not as detailed or prolific, neither do we have sculptures of Nagas from Gandhara. Archaeology is proved to be more instructional. Recent excavations in Swat have succeeded in highlighting the physical diversity of Buddhist monastic sites as well as their relationship to urban centers and the surrounding countryside. And one exemplary case is Bari Fort in Swat, excavated by the Italians very systematically, long-term archaeological initiative, and I think that it's very important to stress that. undertaken since the late 1980s. Excavations are still ongoing here. And what I want to highlight is a quotation from one of the principal investigators of the site, Pier Francesco Caglieri, who said that who made a conscious decision to focus on recovery of context for art and architecture rather than finding art objects to fill museum collections. So I think it's that little difference in the focus that has resulted in amazing results, because here we have an urban center. We know the interface between the urban center and the Buddhist shrines, and they are also exploring and surveying very carefully the river valleys to the south of the city and finding more Buddhist settlements, but also finding interesting examples of water architecture which they're not big photo op moments, because museums cannot display anything based on this. But these are fundamental and very important in order to understand the context, the larger context of land use patterns, resource uses, and how the Buddhists are interacting with non-Buddhist or local communities. And so a concerted effort like this will help us to understand the context for sculptures, such as this from the National Museum in Delhi, where we have a very popular myth located in Swat of the interaction or the conflict between the Buddha and the Naga. You see the Nagas reigning here by a very realistically looking tank, water tank, which seems to be functional. It has this a spout, line-shaped spout with water spilling out. I think I would conclude by saying that the initiative that the Italian mission has taken, focusing very closely and on a long-term range on mapping a site and the region around it, actually gives us a lot more information to work with, both as art historians and as archaeologist historians. And one initiative that I'd like to flag before stopping is the archaeological map of the Swat Valley project, which is ongoing. I think something like that would be very useful for Mathura, because land prices are very expensive in Mathura. It's impossible to excavate. And so the ASI or other organizations could collaborate and go and just map the region, survey the region, careful surveys, which the Italians have shown are very fruitful. So I'll stop there and overshot my time. Thank you.
Now it's time for the discussion. If you have any questions or remarks.
Not really questions, I just wanted to make some comments on this. Thank you very much for the interesting paper. Regarding the Naga cult, some work has been done by Julia Shaw in the, as you know, Sanchi area. And also, one has to be careful about the role of Naga in the Buddhist context, especially in a country like this. It's always associated with border, wherever you have a tank or an uneven, whether it's artificial or natural, whatever, and the Naga cult is there. And also the image that you showed at the end of the Culture Museum, which is the encounter of Siddhartha just before the enlightenment. This is the encounter with Nagakalika. You know, yeah, that's right. So it was, I mean, it's not really a Naga cult. I mean, it's just a part of the story of the enlightenment. So that's come as a second thing. I mean, it's in the panels and also around the stupas. One has to look very carefully about the Naga images, because Nagas were venerated in India and also in Sri Lanka. That's the reason why you get the guard stones with the seven-headed or 11 or 13-headed Buddha, Naga gods in Sri Lanka. So they were venerated, no doubt about it. So this is where I'm a little bit reluctant to accept the Upcycle temple in Song as all dedicated very specifically to Naga. They can come as associated, even as gods, I mean, but not to, I mean, it's very difficult to believe that the temple was dedicated to Naga, so I'll be very skeptical about it.
Thank you, Dr. Puparat. Yes, absolutely. I think that was the point. I agree with you about the Naga temple, the Apsari temple. That was a suggestion made by hurdle based on the sculptures. But you are absolutely right. It's very suspicious that we would have an independent temple dedicated to the Naga because of they were incorporated so much into the religious life of the Buddhists as well as Vaishnavas and the Jains as well. Right. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Karan.
Can you hear me? Yes. The question is to both the speakers. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit or explain to us the prevalence of the iconography of the Makara in Indic art history and archaeology and also here in Sri Lanka? Thank you.
So I'm the oldest. I mean, the way the Makara image appears in Sri Lanka and India is different, and also the composition. I don't want to make a huge dissertation about the Makara images. You get the Makara images in the Gandharan Buddhistas and also in Mathura and also in Nagarjuna, Amaravati, and also other forms of art, later Guptas and all that. So it's it comes as a mythical animal. Composed of different animals. Sri Lanka composes the crocodile, elephant, peacock, monkey, and lion. So those elements are not found in India, and not all the animals, but they come as auspicious animal, Makara. But the context that you elaborated is very, very important. They were found associated with water. And also in Sri Lanka, and also in most of the Indian temples, where the water flows through the mouth of a Makara. So then you get the water association. But it could be, associated with water, and also it could be just a mythical or mystical or animal composed of many elements. So this is a huge subject. It's very different. But the Makaras you find in China or in Central Asia, and also Northwest India, and Middle India, South India, and Sri Lanka, and going to the Southeast Asia. It's a very brief answer. You may have some.
Just something to add interestingly, I don't know how many of you are aware of a very famous life-size statue of the Kushan king Kanishka from Mathura. The king is standing with a sword, and the tip of the sword has the face of a Makara. So the Makara is also somehow related to probably to the symbolism of water, cosmology, to kingship and power in that context. Yes. Mike. At the back. Yeah, from Apsara Temple 1, they found a few small terracotta plaques of goddesses, of Matrika type goddesses. And they, to my mind, they are not cult objects because they're very frequent, frequently found in Mathura region. They're more domestic shrine type of objects. They found nothing else. In Apsara Temple 2, nothing inside, but that statue I showed, that's in worship. It's a four-sided Naga stele that was found in the adjacent modern temple.
It's also found from actually end or the front?
No, the Naga statue was adjacent to the Apsara temple. It was outside. It was being worshipped by the villagers in their shrine. So it had already been removed. Or it may have been an open-air Naga stele that the villagers in modern times enclosed. So it was not found from inside the outside. And the lintels that I showed you, those were found lying outside the Apsara temple. So in such a way that a stone railing around the shrine fell, and that's how they found an in situ, but nothing from inside the apse. In different cultural context and historical context. If you are referring to the fierceness of a dragon, yes, I suppose the Naga and the Makara both have that. But a Naga is, you have anthropomorphic Nagas right, with human bodies and snake hoods. But the form of a makara is very different. It's a composite figure. It has, to my mind, there's no human element in a makara. It's a part crocodile, part fish, part sometimes lion, elephant, and so on as well. I don't know if that answered your question. I don't think so.
Just to continue the answer, I mean, Naga is a part of the Vedic cosmology, as you said very clearly. This is the world of, this is the underworld, and it's fine. I mean, you find as they are beneficial, they have no sense of anything bad with them. So when you look at some of the makara, the dragon images in Chinese artistry, it can have a negative aspect, but they come in a different way. So as Dr. Bas said very clearly, Naga can take that anthropomorphic form, so they can appear as human beings, but makara cannot. But I don't think, to my knowledge, there is no sculptures of makara appearing in a negative aspect. They are associated with water, or they are guardians. Like the best cases in Sri Lanka, at the entrance of all the religious monuments, you get the Naga images in anthropomorphic form, and also the makaras as the on either side of the steps.
But my understanding of the negative associations of the dragon is from the west. From the east, whether it's Chinese or anybody else, the association of the dragon is always positive, or the Naga. So it's always positive. It's just the Western connotations that have the dragon as something that's negative, that needs to be destroyed. And the Eastern has always been, as far as I remember, from what I've read, is that it's always been positive, whether it's China or Japan or any of the other Eastern countries. Am I correct?
Yes. The western part is, of course, we know about it. Dragon with flames, right? So it has a very negative aspect. China, some context it can be negative, but mostly it's positive. But as we said very clearly, not in the South Asian context or Southeast Asian context. The dragon comes as a positive element. Especially in Angkor, in Angkor Wat and other places in Cambodia. Camera, it comes really as a positive element.
From India, Dr. Ajit Kumar. Topic of the presentation is structural studies as parameter for deriving chronological index for Buddhist caves in western Maharashtra. Sir Campus EC, third 80. I'd like to invite Dr. Kumar to make the presentation.
Good morning, Namaskar, Honorable Chairperson and dear friends. My topic for the presentation is cultural styles as a parameter for deriving a chronological index for Buddhist caves in western Maharashtra. Western Maharashtra has the largest number of Buddhist rock-cut caves, which number around more than 1,200, and they are spread over 50 sites, and chronologically they belong to two periods. The early period lasting from 1st century BC to around 3rd century AD, and the later period commencing around 4th century AD and lasting to around 7th century AD. The early caves in western Maharashtra are of the Hinayana order, and the later ones are of Mahayana period. The Hinayana caves again can be divided into two, and the Hinayana period you don't find images of Buddha at all in this representations. Most of the representations in sculpture what you see is either auspicious motifs, semi-auspicious motifs and decorative motifs, apart from architectural ones. We have very few representations of narrative panels. That's basically because these caves were once upon a time painted with different Jataka stories and other aspects related to Buddhism, so their duplication in sculpture was not properly necessitated. And the early caves belong to the period of the Shatavahana Kshatrapa rule in Western Maharashtra, and the later ones belong to the period of the Vakataka rule, contemporary to the Guptas. Now, studies that have been conducted, which have been conducted on Western Indian caves, I mean, it's over a century of work has been done on Western Indian caves, right from Burgess and Ferguson and so on, and his voluminous work on prophet caves of India. Basic studies basically have concentrated on the architectural elements and their chronology. And if you examine the published records of regarding chronology and date, there is no uniformity in the dates derived by different scholars because of varying interpretations of the primary parameters, which is historical and paleographic features of inscriptions which are found in the cave, have been variously interpreted by scholars, and this has resulted in a deviance of date. Like some of the scholars have gone and chosen a comparative parameter in Ashokan Brahmi inscriptions, and when they use Ashokan Brahmi inscriptions for a comparative study, the dates go higher. And similarly, when they go for Kshatrapa inscriptions as a reference point, the dates derived are later. And earlier paleographers and people who have worked on the inscriptions had a tendency to date them very early, like Buehler and the British servants who have worked, Buehler or even Senat and people like that had a tendency to date them early, while Dani and other people who are working on it recently, they have a tendency to date it very late. And in this controversy, another theory factor is the historical parameter, or which is considered in dating. Now, Shatavahanas, who ruled in that region from early 1st century BC, have left inscriptions in some of the caves in Western India. But again, the historical parameters of Shatavahana is also ridden with controversy because they treat Purana also as a source and trying to accommodate all the things mentioned in Puranas. There are two deviant theories about the historicity of Shatavahanas. One dates Shatavahanas to around their origin to around 2nd century BC, and another group dates it to around late 1st century BC. So in this confusion, normally the dates that have been carried over, analyzing the parameters of history and paleography, is assigned to the cave themselves also. And in such a scenario, it happens that the sculptures in the cave also come to be assigned the dates, which is derived through analysis of historical and paleographical parameters. Many times it so happens that the sculptural style doesn't match with the chronology assigned to the cave. And in such situations, the normal statement that is assigned is trying to either date these sculptures early or late. Some of the caves, they show early features, but the sculptures show a very advanced style. So in that case, the sculpture is definitely and generally assigned to a later period. And if we make it on the broad analysis of architectural, paleographic and historical aspects together, the early phase, that was the Hingani phase, which I said, which commences from 1st century BC to around 3rd century AD, can be divided into two. The first period synchronizes with the rule of the early Shatavahana, and period 2 synchronizes with the Kshatrapa Shatavahana reign. And like I said, some of these contain inscriptions of the early rulers. Now, with the problem existing in the number of kings and the confusion existing in the starting the reign period of the early Shatavahanas, dating the caves of period 1 has been problematic. Because the second group of caves of period 2 are relatively easy to date because they have inscriptions of the later Shatavahana rulers and the Shatamana, later Shatamana rulers has a synchronization with the Shatrapa rulers. Because Nagapana was defeated by Gautamiputra Shataka in 124 AD, and because Nagapana's inscriptions are dated in Saka era, there was a stronger foundation for dating these later dates. Next one. Now in all these things, like I said, the sculptural parameter in the caves are not being assessed properly to even find out if they can provide a chronological sequence or a chronological date or cross-check the existing dates. So in this particular attempt, apart from the broad style of the sculptures that they show, I am also trying to analyze the smaller parameters which the sculpture depicts, especially the coiffure, the costume and things like that, which actually have a very short lifespan. Even in modern context, you see that the dresses, they have a very short period of style. Like for example, the men have bell bottoms. Bell bottoms were a style in the pants which was common in the 70s. Then you have the narrows coming again, then the bell bottoms coming. In similar fashion, you have also dressed in costumes which have got a limited lifespan, which keeps repeating. And so I have also, apart from the broad style, I have also tried to analyze the smaller parameters with other sites, contemporary sites, which have yielded dated inscriptions. So the basic issue with this is, the basic contention is in this comparison would be that all the sites, all the Buddhist sites especially in the Deccan and North India, have been in connection with each other due to the movement of clergy, movement of artisans, movement of the pilgrims, and so generally in a given period of time there would be a commonality in style and motifs. And inscriptions also support this. If you examine the inscriptions from Sanchi, Baru, in Western Indian caves, you see that people from various places coming in making donations to the caves and Buddhist monasteries. Now, if you examine the earliest of sculptures, the Bhaja sculptures in cave 22 are stylistically the most earliest, and in this you can observe now these figures are very shallow in nature, and like I told you earlier, most of the sculptural representations are auspicious in nature, and in Bhaja cave 22 you have 4 Dwarapala Ikshas, and the Dwarapala Ikshas, they are shown in very shallow relief, and the feet is not frontally placed. You can see them that the feet is actually placed sideways, and they have armory in their hands. And the artistic style also tends to over elaborate the coiffure and costume and jewelry. The details are actually more elaborated in this particular Bhaja sculpture. They are very shallow, and there is a tendency to show the image in a frontal way, showing both the shoulders and the depiction is a style which is seen in Bhaja sculptures. Obar, Bhaja, Karla, Kondene and Natsur show a similarity in style. They are actually very shallow with a basic character for expansion of details of our ornaments and coiffure and costumes. Now, in the same cave, you have 2 narrative reliefs, and this particular relief is identified now as a Prasenjit panel. King Prasenjit is supposed to have visited Buddha in his arama, and earlier this had been identified as Surya, but the contention doesn't hold good because you have a cavalier here, a cavalier at the back also, and this is not a typical traditional identification or a representation, iconographical representation of Surya, because Surya's representation is found in Bodh in the traditional way, where you have 4 horses drawing a chariot with Usha and Pratyusha shown. So this particular identification of this has been controversial, but now it has been identified by Prasenjita and it's published by me. And the second one, which is also again identified with Indra, again this has narrative sequences. In the whole panel there is a story going on. So this is also a narrative panel. This is identified with Kulavaka Jataka. In Kulavaka Jataka, Saka in the heavens resided along with Asuras, and he had tricked the asuras by intoxicating them and had them thrown away from the heavens. And when the people, when the asuras realized that they had been tricked and thrown out of the heavens, they decided to climb back. And you can see some people here trying to climb back to the heavens. So realizing the asuras are coming back to the heavens, Indra comes on his elephant and then he destroys the forest where this particular asuras are staying. And in the melee that follows, you see that the Garudakas or the forest dwelling creatures are escaping out of the forest. And at the end of the story, it is stated in the Kulavaka Jataka, it is stated that he goes and marries a lady called Haigon, and he makes her the chief dancer. So here you can see the king with the chief dancer and accompanying musicians. So this is Kulavaka Jataka. Next one. Now, one of the sculptures which show, which is in relatively very high relief, is the Yakshi figure which is carved in the Bhaja Chaitya Hall. And this figure, in its stylistic nature, has got very common, similar features with those represented at Bodh Gaya. This is a figure in Bodh Gaya, and stylistically it has got a very similarity with the Bodh Gaya images. Now, Bodh Gaya, in fact, it's well accepted by scholars that Bodh Gaya falls midway between Bharuch and Sanchi. In similar fashion to the Bhaja sculptures, in Pitalkhora also you see very shallow sculptures with a lot of emphasis for details on jewelry and ornaments. Okay, Yaksham and Pitalkhora also, you notice them, they are actually carved in higher relief than the ones which you saw at Bhaja, and they have got rounded proportions and better execution. You can see that the feet has now come to be carved naturally, and this particular image is an Yakshara from Pitalkhora again. It's a loose image which has been crafted by Kanha. There is an inscription in the hand which says it was crafted by Kanha, a goldsmith by profession, and hailing from Thanakataka in eastern Andhra Pradesh. Now, Pitalkhora figures also, like I said, have got stylistic similarity. You can observe that the dressing style, where the ladies and gents wear the dhoti in the kasha style, and it remains above the ankle. And in the headgear also, you will notice that there is a similarity of style which you observe in Pitalkhora, Bhaja, and also in the figures at Nagpur. Now, Pitalkhora figures also have a similarity in style with Kondane figures, because of the fact that Kanha, the dwarf image which I just showed you, his disciple Balaka had carved many of the figures in Kondane, as inscriptions state. So you see that there is a tendency to remove the surface detailing which is seen in the sculptures of Pitalkhora, early Pitalkhora sculptures, and then the emphasis shifts on to carving human body in different postures and with elegance and suppleness and beauty. Now, Bodh Gaya, I just previously told that there is a similarity with Pitalkhora and Bhaja sculptures with Bodh Gaya. Now, these are two images from the Bodh Gaya. What I would like you to notice is that this particular motif, which is carved, they are Rituna figures, which are carved on the pillar posts of Bodh Gaya. You have these these images being railed or enclosed within a frame. The lower portion you have the Vedika railing. On either sides you have the pot, capital and pot base pillars with a sphinx like creature on the top, and certain toranas or certain floral motifs falling from the top. Now, stylistically, apart from the similarity these Bodh Gaya sculptures share with Pitalkhora and Kondane, they also share a similarity with the ones in Sanchi. Now, these are two pillars again with the same Mithuna motifs, and you also notice this image is from Sanchi, though the sculptures tend to show for overcrowding, but stylistically you see that similarity here also, that you have two pillared posts on either side and with the panel being carved in the center. Now Bodh Gaya. Now lately Bodh Gaya is again a problem, because again people have relied on inscriptions and the paleography and things like that. Now going from known to unknown is a tendency in archaeology. So if you examine, like I told you, many of the epigraphs in Western India are not dated, so is Bodh Gaya. Now one of the earliest epigraphs to have a date and also a sculpture in it is the Amohini panel. Now this is the Amohini panel from Mathura, and this is dated to the period of Sodasa, and it is dated in Vikrama era of 72 AD, and equivalent in the AD 72 Vikrama era, and equivalent in AD will be around 14 AD. Now this particular image, if you take this as a stylistic parameter, you will again notice that on either side you have these quad-based quad capital pillars, and with floral motifs falling into the interior of the panel. Similarly, you will notice the same, almost similar style to Bodh Gaya. Now, if Amohini panel can be dated to 14th century, AD 14, then Bodh Gaya cannot be very far off in date from Amohini panel. And similarly, another parameter which we would like to examine is that the sculptures of Bhutli, Bedsa and Karle. They are three cases. They show a similarity in style, especially the treatment of the dhoti, which is translucent, and the body nature, which is shown as very massive and very beautifully executed. Then the coiffure with a mushroom-shaped projection in it. And this particular depiction has the Garuda and the Naga. In fact, they are actually opponents or enemies to each other, but here you show them actually as chowri bearers or fly disc bearers to the symbolic representation of Buddha. In fact, and you have stupas also carved on either side. Now another place where this particular style is seen is Bedsa. The Bedsa sculptures are concentrated on the pillar capitals, and here you see that the emphasis is on the horse, and there is only one particular rider shown on the top, which is similar to Sanchi's in its style. And in Karle, which this particular style continues, and you have a pair of figures seated on the elephants. Here you have horses and elephants shown in Bedsa cave, but in Karla cave, facing the interior of the cave, you only have elephants, and in the reverse you have horses shown. Now Karle sculptures, I'm just taking an example here. They will show a very great similarity with the Amohini panel. Now Amohini panel also with the Sanchi sculptures. Now this is a Mithuna figure from Karle, and you can just see the broad stylistic similarity. I'll go to the next one, which will show you. Now this is the main heroine in the Amohini panel. And you can see the broad similarity that exists between the figures in Karle and the one at Amohini panel. Now what I would like you to notice is this particular Chudamani, or the ornament which lies on the forehead, and the one which you see in the Karle figures. Now this particular, in Western Indian sculptures, this Chudamani is a feature which is only noticed in Karle sculptures. It is not seen in the Pitagora or subsequent sculptures, and that is also noticed in the Mathura figures as well as the Amohini figures. So making these figures, that is the Karle ones and the Amohini figure, all datable to 1st century AD in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 1st century AD. You can see the dressing style, the general physique of the ladies and the treatment of the physique of the ladies, and all of it. Because this is Amohini panel is partly worn out, so the details are not very forthcoming, but general similarity is striking. Next one. And so is the Ekshad. I'm just taking the same Mithuna figure, and you can observe that there is also a similarity which it shares with Sanchi. Now Sanchi Torana of the southern Torana has an inscription of the King Satakarni. So now the controversy that surrounds Satakarni, whether he should be dated into pre-Christian era or the Christian era, is in a way solved here, because if you take the first century AD as Ammohini panel to be around 14 or 15 AD, and naturally then you have to pay Satakarni, who is carved with southern Toranna, also to around the first 2 decades of the time. Now here, especially in the coffier, and you can see the ornaments here. They can, in fact, the same type of haras or long chains are also noticed in Kavle, because I have reduced the number of slides, so I have not been able to include all of them. But they share a very great similarity with the Sanchi figures. So that brings us to the first part. I said it can be divided into two. The first phase, so the early Shatavahana rule now will go to the propounders of the theory that Shatavahanas must have emerged around 30 BC and ruled to around first century AD, mid of first century AD. I mean, that theory holds more value than placing in Shatavahanas in the second century BC or first century BC. Stylistically, the sculptors agree with the date of a later date to the Shatavahana date. Now, in the period 2, the earliest cave of period 2 is Torana of Nasik Cave 3. Nasik Cave 3, you have an inscription of Gautamiputra Shatakarni. Gautamiputra Shatakarni defeated Nahapana in 46 Saka era, 46 or 47 Saka era, which equates with 124 AD. Now this then becomes, this particular Torana becomes a stylistic benchmark of 124 AD, and you can notice the differences in style when you compare it to the period 1. Here you will see that there is a tremendous influence of the Mathura school of art in Nasik Torana, and here you have Bacchanalian scenes which are very commonly seen in the Mathura school of art, and you have also certain Mithuna panels. Then this is a Shalavanjika panel here, and these motifs, as art historians would know, the Shalavanjikas and the Bacchanalian scenes are very famous in Mathura school of art, and in Western Indian caves, this is the only cave, that is cave 3 is the only cave where you have these motifs very explicitly found. And also you can see the stylistic treatment of these two Dwarapala yakshas. You can mark the difference. At the early phase, they had arms in their hands. You had seen them with bow and arrows and things like that, but that has been abandoned, and in their places you see that the right hand always have lotus flowers or a bunch of lotus flowers, and the left hand is always in akimbo. Left or right, as the case may be, one hand is placed in akimbo, and this particular stylistic feature comes during the second phase, or the period 2 of the Hinayana period, where we have tremendous influence of the Mathura school. Now again, coming back to a common factor which I would like to draw here. Now this particular figure, in the treatment of the waist cloth, you will see that it is rolled onto one side and then it is left as a as a trefoil down. And you notice a similar style in also in treatment of this particular waistband or the Uttaraya in also in the Mathura school. So this is just one example I am trying to show you, but you will see that this is also noticed. It is also prevalent in the Amaravati school. This particular treatment of the Uttaraya. Now similarly you will see that there is a waistband which is placed in a U shape towards the front. Now this also stylistically is one feature which you notice starting off in the Kushana school at Mathura, and then it is also you will see them continued in Amaravati. And again this also is another Yaksha figure, and fortunately identifying this figure as Yaksha, there is an inscription on the top saying that it is the donation. So this figure is definitely of an Yaksha, and you will notice that here also in the early cave at Nasik you had a bunch, but now it is being replaced by single lotus. Now in this particular single lotus probably lays the germ of the concept of Bodhisattva Padmapani. Though he has not emerged as Padmapani, but you see that Padma is held in the hand. So Padma in the hand, if you just correlate it together, it could be a germ of the concept of Padmapani emerging in Western India during this period in cave number 18. This belongs to the period of Purmavi. Now at Kanigiri, there are actually few figures which includes Naga and Mithunas. Now you can see a marked contrast from the Mithuna figures which are seen at Karla. You can see that the headgear, the ornaments, especially the Singha Kundalas and Makar Kundalas which they wear, and the treatment of the drapery, the long slender legs which they have, they in fact remind you of the the Amaravati school of sculptures. And this was carved during the time of Yajna Shatakarni, and it's an extension of the Amaravati school in a way. And these are a few figures of the Kanheri capitals, which again draw stylistic similarity with the Amaravati figures. Next one. And these are figures from Kanheri. Certain motifs like the Purna Kalsha, which is also seen in some of the sculptures in Sri Lanka, never appears in elsewhere in Western Indian case. This is the image of Naga. And with the emergence of Buddha images, these are the two Buddha images which are found in Kanheri, and with the emergence of Buddha images, it does not introduce in the interior of the cave, but it comes in the courtyard, on the basement of a pillar, and with the introduction of Buddha images, these again show stylistic similarity with the Amaravati school. With this image introduction of Buddha, the seepage of Mahayanic philosophy from both Amaravati and Mathura comes to take its stand in Western India. Thanks to all, and I thank everybody present in the hall, and also the organizers, the SAR Cultural Center at Sri Lanka, and my thanks especially to Sanjay Garg.
Yes, Doctor.
I want to ask a rather silly seeming question. Now, India has a very strong software industry, and I would imagine that comparing styles would be a very obvious thing for what is called pattern recognition. If you go to even cameras like this, there is face recognition. And if you go into the software which you can download, Picasa, it identifies a face and goes down pointer, thumbprint, which you enter. So your work is done by you, not by it's not done by Indian software.
I think because in many of the studies, the concentration is not on sculptures alone. They will take you to aspects of architecture and things like that. Nobody has concentrated on the sculptural art in Western India, so nobody has done it. And most of the studies that have been done on art in India, it's actually many of them are following the traditional ones which have been followed during the British period and things like that. They stick on to that particular thing. Very few studies have been done in the post-independence period, and only they were published. That's another problem.
Dr. Kumar, I thank you very much for your interesting paper. There are a few comments I would like to make about the questions that you raised about the chronology. As you know, when you talk about the Indian chronology, it's very difficult to come to an agreement about the eras and other aspects. Before I come to that, I just wanted to make, just one aspect of the parallel that you made with Bodh Gaya, Sanchi and Betsa. On the frame, the two columns on either side, and these are very clear Persepolitan type of columns with the two animals back to back. That aspect is found on the Sanchi number 1, especially the Toranas, and then it goes to and also in Bodh Gaya and also in Betsa, and it's abandoned after. So then you get another frame coming into action. The thing is that if you date Sanchi to 30 BC, that's the dating of the Satakarni.
Not 30, 30 BC is the date when the Satavahanas founded the dynasty by Siluka.
Yeah, so that's quite late.
Yeah, but stylistically, if you take Amavali panel and Sodasa's inscription, stylistically many of them would actually only go to the first century AD. during the Christian era.
So are you referring to Sanchi 1 or Sanchi 2? Now Sanchi 1.
The one which I showed you, the particular pillars with pot base and pot capital, they are in the post of Sanchi number 10, Sanchi Stupa number 2, which is dated early.
That's right.
So definitely the Sanchi Stupa 1 comes later to it.
Yeah.
So that Sanchi number, this thing has got, one has got the inscription of Satakani.
Right.
So that makes Satakani later.
So other question is coming to the Saka and the Vikram era.
Okay.
Right, so it's either there are three possibilities today. Either you take 72, 78 as one possibility, or you take the 57 BC, or the later development made by Harry Falk recently, on the inscription evidence from Gandhara. Now he goes to 48, 47 BC. So I think, did you take that into consideration?
No. In fact, I have not taken that into consideration because in my analysis, I found that the stylistic dates go with the second portion, the period 2, which I have assigned, as more dateable, securely dateable, because you take 46 Saka era as Nahapana's date. So that stylistically matches. So the style which is developed in Cave 3 is not found in Karli. So it has to be dated earlier than 123 AD. And 120 AD you have got Nahapana's cave number 10. So cave number 10, if you date it even 120 or 110 AD, definitely Karla and the group which I discussed, they definitely show a style which is earlier than 120 AD. Now in between there is a big gap. When the Kshatrapas invaded Western India, the Shatravahanas were displaced from Western India. So there is a gap of 40-50 years. So if you take, because many of the caves which were worked remain incomplete during this period of Tasset. So if you give them 40 years for this particular break, then it will again go to the first decade, few decades of the first century. So that's
right. I mean, there are a lot of questions regarding this, but anyhow, the analysis is perfect. So one has to be extremely careful, and also I'm very little bit skeptical about the image with the lotus in the hand. When you look at the recent book written by Gerard Puspan, and also the article which has just come out by Paul Harrison and Tristan Dulcinea, right? So this should be taken into account. It's not easy from the North Indian and Northwestern Indian point of view to really define when the Avalokiteshvara image appeared. I mean, it can be quite late. It comes as a Mahasattva, Bodhisattva.
I just wanted to, what I emphasized was because there is inscription stating that this is an Yaksha.
Yes.
So what I just tried to show was that there is an allusion in the presentation of Yaksha as a Dwarapala, where he showed with arms guarding and that thing. And during from the time of Shatakani onwards, Shatakani onwards, the arms are replaced by lotuses in their hands. So it's the basic same Yaksha, it's the same Dwarapala Yaksha. They are shown at the door only, and there is conceptually there is a change. Their arms are replaced by lotuses. And you see, I have shown you the last two images in Kaneri. Again, you see that in Kaneri also, for the first time, you see lotus bearing Yakshas flanking Buddha.
Yeah, but that's the Mathura. That's the Mathura.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree on that. Basic question is about state ecology, but we'll discuss this.
Thank you.
Time allocated for the session is almost over. So unfortunately, we've been listening to three interesting speeches. Thank you for your tremendous contribution in this session, and thank you for the audience for your participation. This is the end of this morning session.